And I would like to start the second session on hematology.
Yes.
I would like to invite Dr. Kundan Mishra from New Delhi and Dr. Tilak from Pune. Are you all there?
And Dr. Sawant sir, I'd like to tell all the faculty members that on the portal, we have around 300 plus joinees right now on the audience
Wow.
side.
Very good, very good.
It's a good thing on the Saturday evening. So
There
by
was
6
an
o'clock,
academic hunger which we are trying to.
yeah.
Good, Suman. Kudos to you.
No,
Kudos
sir,
to
all thanks to ISO. So I think we have 300, 350 plus people. So I think by evening, we should touch 400.
Yes,
Over
yes.
to Dr. Kundan Mishra, sir, who is with Army Research and RNR Hospital here as the senior hematologist. So I'd like to introduce him to the ISO faculty here. So over to Dr. Kundan.
Good evening, Dr. Sumant Gupta sir. Thank you, all of you, and indeed, it's a pleasure to be part of ISO and to be a part of this conference. And without wasting much of time, I think I'd like to invite Dr. Satish, who is a senior oncologist from the southern part of the country, and he's going to talk on acalabrutinib. So, Dr. Satish, welcome. Kindly start.
Thank you, sir. I hope my slides are visible and my voice is audible, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much to the ISO organizing team for giving me an opportunity. So I'll be talking in the next 15-20 minutes about the role of acalabrutinib in treatment naive and relapsed refractory CLL. This is the overview. I'll be talking a short time about the role of protein kinase inhibitors in CLL and the Elevate TN trial, which led to the approval of acalabrutinib in treatment naive CLL, Ascent trial, which led to the approval of acalabrutinib in relapsed refractory CLL, and couple of studies about the pooled safety data of acalabrutinib in CLL patients. So there are many unmet needs in the treatment of CLL. We all know that, and CLL being a disease of elderly, many patients have comorbid conditions, around 90% in the real world data. And among these 90%, half of them, at least 45% of them, will have a serious comorbidity. And we see that CLL being an incurable disease, we need to give options which will give good quality of life for the patients. So the treatment has evolved in the last few years, and we have moved. There is a paradigm shift in the treatment, and we have moved away from chemoimmunotherapy to targeted therapies. Targeted therapies are mainly BTK inhibitors and BCL2 inhibitors like venetoclax. So let us talk about the BTK inhibitors. BTK inhibitors have definitely evolved in the treatment of CLL. The first drug which was approved was ibrutinib, and these are three phase 3 trials done with ibrutinib in treatment naive patients. The Resonate 2, which compared ibrutinib to chlorambucil as a single agent, and Illuminate trial is where the ibrutinib plus Gazyva or obinutuzumab were compared to chlorambucil and obinutuzumab. So we can ask, why chlorambucil, why not bendamustine rituximab? So this alliance trial, again in treatment naive patients, where they compared ibrutinib single agent to bendamustine rituximab. And if you see across all the three trials, there was significant progression-free survival difference with ibrutinib compared to the control arm. It was whether it was chlorambucil, whether it was bendamustine rituximab, or chlorambucil and obinutuzumab, you can see that there is a significant progression-free survival. I'll come to the Elevate trial in a bit. But the problem with ibrutinib, when we see the real-world data, is that about quarter of the patients need dose reduction due to adverse events, due to intolerance, and 15 to 20% of the patients require dose reduction. This is apart from progression. Just because of the intolerance, around quarter of the patients discontinue the drug. So we need something better, which is well tolerated and which has less discontinuation because of adverse events. So we have a second generation BTK inhibitor, which is acalabrutinib, which is highly selective, potent, irreversible BTK inhibitor. The class is the same. The acalabrutinib, the efficacy on the BTK is the same, but the drugs are completely different in terms of adverse effect profile. So if you see this kinase maps, this green dot is the BTK kinase, and if you see the inhibition is the same with acalabrutinib and ibrutinib, but look at the red dots. Red dots are the off-target kinases inhibited or interacted by these drugs. The size of the red dot shows us how potent the drug interact with that kinase. So if you see the kinase map of acalabrutinib, there are only 6 kinases which are inhibited or interact with acalabrutinib, whereas there are 36 kinases which ibrutinib interact with. So that is why we see a lot of adverse events with ibrutinib. For example, ibrutinib acts on EGFR. That is the reason we see patients having diarrhea. Then there is a kinase called TEC kinase on platelets, which is inhibited by ibrutinib, leading to decreased platelet aggregation. And that is why there is a risk of major bleeding with ibrutinib. All these significant off-target kinases are not inhibited by acalabrutinib. Hence, acalabrutinib is more safer than ibrutinib, which we will see soon. So this was the trial which led to the approval of acalabrutinib in previously untreated CLL. It is a randomized 3-arm trial where acalabrutinib plus minus obinutuzumab was compared to chlorambucil and obinutuzumab. As I said, these were treatment naive patients, and the patients of all the age groups more than 18 were studied. If you look at the demographics, they were well comparable across all the 3 arms. Around 180 patients were studied in all the arms, and if you see the bad prognostic unmutated IGHV was present in around 60 to 70% across all the groups. So look at the results. At a median follow-up around 3 months, there was significant difference in the progression-free survival between either acalabrutinib alone or acalabrutinib Gazyva compared to chlorambucil and Gazyva. So there was almost 90% reduction of progression, death, or relapse with acalabrutinib Gazyva compared to chlorambucil Gazyva. There was 80% risk of relative risk reduction compared to acalabrutinib monotherapy alone compared to chlorambucil and Gazyva. So there is a significant difference in the progression-free survival. What about the subgroup? So this is the forest plot. If you see, the benefit was across all the subgroups, whether the age was young, whether it was stage 4 RAI stage, or whether it was bulky disease, or in any of these high-risk prognostic factors, deletion 17p, IGHV, unmutated status, complex karyotype. In all the subgroups, the benefit was seen with acalabrutinib compared to chlorambucil and Gazyva. What about the adverse event? Majority of the adverse events were grade 1 and grade 2. The grade 3 adverse effects was mainly cytopenias, which was more with addition of Gazyva compared to acalabrutinib alone. So the cytopenias was quite reversible. Infusion-related reaction was again because of Gazyva. It was not seen with acalabrutinib monotherapy. Thrombocytopenia, cytopenia. So as I said, they were all reversible cytopenias. There was no significant rash when compared to ibrutinib, which has significant adverse effect of rash. Pneumonia was seen in around 2% of the patients. What about the main adverse events? What we are worried about ibrutinib? The 3 main adverse events of ibrutinib, which led to discontinuation in real-world data, is atrial fibrillation, bleeding, and hypertension. So if you look at the rates of atrial fibrillation with acalabrutinib, it was about 4%. And 3% with acalabrutinib and Gazyva. There were no ventricular tachyarrhythmias reported at all in this trial with acalabrutinib, and hypertension was seen in around 5 to 7% of the patients. The risk of discontinuation was extremely low. It was around 9 to 10% with acalabrutinib plus minus Gazyva compared to around quarter of the patients with ibrutinib. The dose reductions also seen only in 3% of the patients with acalabrutinib. So this was well tolerated and significant progression-free survival compared to the control arm. What about first-line treatment? Sorry, in a relapse refractory setting. So this ASCENT trial was a study done in relapse refractory CLL patients, which again led to the approval of acalabrutinib in this setting of relapse refractory patients. In this study, around 155 patients were randomized either to acalabrutinib monotherapy or investigator choice treatment, whether it was bendamustine rituximab or idelalisib rituximab, which was approved as a combination across US So the investigator can decide whether in this relapsed refractory patients, whether to give bendamustine rituximab or adalimumab rituximab. Again, the demographics were well matched. Because it is relapsed refractory group, you can see the bad prognostic subgroups are very significantly high. 17p deletion was seen in 18%. TP53 mutation was seen in 26% of the patients. Unmutated IGHV was seen in almost 77% of the patients. So we are dealing with a bad subgroup of patients. Even in this trial, the progression-free survival at almost 2 years was significantly better with acalabrutinib compared to the control arm, which is adalimumab rituximab or bendamustine rituximab. There was 73% risk reduction with acalabrutinib compared to the group. Even when they studied independently bendamustine rituximab or adalimumab rituximab, the benefit was quite evident. There was 73% risk reduction with acalabrutinib compared to adalimumab rituximab and 70% reduction compared to bendamustine rituximab. So the benefit again was seen in all the subgroups, whether it was bulky disease, whether a bad prognostic markers were present like 17p deletion, TP53, IGHV unmutated. So we can see that the benefit was seen in along all the subgroups of patients with acalabrutinib compared to the control arm, which is bendamustine rituximab or adalimumab. The grade 1, the most of the majority of the adverse events were just grade 1 and grade 2 side effects. As again, I said, majority of them were cytopenias, which were all reversible, very few discontinuations. And again, atrial fibrillation was seen in only 5 to 6% of the patients on acalabrutinib, hypertension 5%. Bleeding also was seen in around 2 to 3% of the patients. And even in this study, there were no ventricular tachyarrhythmias. The discontinuation rate was around 14% in this trial with acalabrutinib, and 4% of the patients required dose reduction. So compared to ibrutinib, we can see that the side effect profile is completely different. It is more safer drug. With ibrutinib, the atrial fibrillation was around 15 to 18%, hypertension was around 15%, and major bleeding was seen in 10%, which was not the case with acalabrutinib. They looked at pooled safety data around 1,000 patients across various phase 1 to 3 studies, 9 phase 1 to 3 studies in various indications were studied. And we can see that with acalabrutinib, the majority of the adverse effects were grade 1 to grade 3, very few grade 3 side effects. The one peculiar adverse effect seen with acalabrutinib was headache, which was again self-limiting, usually seen in the first 2-3 weeks, and it gets relieved with caffeine or paracetamol. Infections is a problem with acalabrutinib, but the grade 2 to grade more than grade 3 infections was seen in 17%, most of them manageable. Major hemorrhage was less than 3%. Cardiac side effects was seen in less than 5%. Secondary primary malignancies have to be looked into, especially basal cell carcinoma and non-melanoma skin cancers. There is also an update from ASH looking at only the risk of cardiovascular events. Again, if you see the risk of cardiovascular events, whether it's atrial fibrillation, hypertension, remained very low in all the patients studied in the major 3 to 4 phase 3 trials. The risk of atrial fibrillation, sinus tachycardia, hypertension was quite low, less than 5% across the pooled data. And the risks also were quite significant in the first 6 months to 1 year, and the adverse events used to decrease over time. So to end, acalabrutinib is a more specific, irreversible inhibitor of Bruton kinase. It is highly effective both in frontline and relapsed CLL. The efficacy is the same as ibrutinib, but it comes at an advantage of reduced side effects, especially the cardiovascular events. There's low rate of hypertension, atrial fibrillation, and major bleeding episodes significantly compared to ibrutinib. There is a trial going on, Elevate RR trial, where they're comparing acalabrutinib with ibrutinib, not just for efficacy, for adverse events. The data will come up soon. But the news is that the risk of side effects is extremely low with acalabrutinib when compared to ibrutinib in treatment-naive patients. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity. If there are any questions, I'll take them now.
Thank you, Dr. Satish. You have really summed it up very nicely. And yes, it is always a good thing to have more choices from a group of drugs with lesser and lesser side effects. The only issue I feel is that cost, the financial toxicity, what we call usually in all the conferences, it keeps on increasing with every new drugs in India. At the same time, I welcome Tilak sir, a very dear friend and a senior and a guide. I don't know what all things. So, sir, good evening and your vote.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome, Tilak, sir.
My compliments to the organizers for giving me the opportunity, and thank you, Kundan. Sorry, I joined a bit late. Was with the university exams for the undergraduates, got late a little bit. It's a pleasure to be on this session. One thing about acalabrutinib which was quite striking was when it suddenly came up for its use even in COVID-19. In the Solidarity trial, they started including one arm of using acalabrutinib for COVID. Of course, they immediately withdrew it, I think, within about a month or so of starting using it. So it seems to be a promising kid on the block. And with the kind of data which you have shown and its efficacy, looks to be quite promising for use. We can continue, Kundan, please.
So I think we'll keep, if there's any question, otherwise we'll keep the question towards the end also. And I'd like to invite the next speaker meanwhile. So Dr. Satish, thank you very much. And I invite now Dr. Farhan. He's been a very dear friend since those days of Sir Gangaram Hospitals and all. A very pleasing personality, and not from only my point of view, but even patients. Once they meet Dr. Farhan, they are always fan of Dr. Farhan. They want to be treated by him only. So it's very risky to send for a second opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Kundan. And
please welcome. And
yes, you can say, Dr. Kundan. Okay, so a very good evening, and thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present on the diagnosis and management of CML. So especially I thank Dr. Sumant Gupta sir for giving me this opportunity. So I'll be speaking today on the diagnosis and management of CML in 2021. So it's a big topic, and I've been given a 15 minutes time to speak on it. So mostly I would be talking on the updates, recent updates on CML in chronic phase. So flow of content would be the basic evaluation, baseline evaluation, the risk stratification and significance, treatment goals, choosing right TKI and switching over, and the treatment-free remission. So I'll start in this case, the 45-year gentleman on routine checkup found to have elevated TLC, not much attention was paid at that time. So he presented 6 months later with increasing fatigue. So this time he had a further rise in the TLC, 2% peripheral blast, anemia, and a hepatosplenomegaly. So it's quite obvious for everyone. Everyone will think of an MPN, and everyone will go for a qualitative BCR-ABL PCR. So it came out to be positive. So many of us, many a time, they don't go for the bone marrow aspiration and biopsy, and they directly start the TKI when there is a very straightforward case of a CML-CP. And now coming to the, this is the from the ELN guidelines. So what they recommend is, so we should do all these things. Everyone knows that there should be a physical examination with the spleen and liver size, a complete blood count with the peripheral smear, a bone marrow aspiration, cytogenetics, and a core biopsy if dry tap. So they have advised core biopsy only if there's a dry tap to look for the fibrosis, but most of us has a practice to go for the biopsy in all the cases. And I think it's justified. And the qualitative BCR-ABL, PCR, and FISH if pH negativity, and a biochemistry. So now what the major stress is in the ELN guideline is that we should go for cytogenetics in all the patients. So why we need a cytogenetics? We should look for any other cytogenetic abnormality in the baseline to find out for the accepted phase, if we do in the case of suspected disease progression, to exclude the high risk additional chromosomal anomalies. So this is a change in this recent guidelines. Previously they were kept in a warning sign, but now they kept it at a high risk because there is high risk of treatment failure and resistance. To rule out baseline disease progression and a patient who have a rare or atypical PCR-ABL transcripts, and we should go for the FISH monitoring. So next, coming to the high risk additional chromosomal anomalies. So currently the ELN recommends that these patients, as already discussed, should be taken as a high risk patient, and this include a trisomy 8, a second pH positive pH chromosome, isochrome 17q, trisomy 19, monosomy 7, 11q and 3q, aberrations, and the complex karyotype. And they should be predict a poor response, and preferably should be taken for a second line TKI. Coming to the atypical BCR-ABL transcripts, we sometimes face this difficulty because it's present only 2 to 4% of the patients, basically because of the lack of ABL1 exon 2 or from the atypical BCR breakpoints. Why it is important? Because we can miss it using the routine probes. And if we are not doing it as a baseline, because many go just for the cytogenetics, if they find the Philadelphia chromosome, they don't go for the qualitative PCR in the baseline. So it should be done, because otherwise we'll give a false impression of complete molecular response. So coming to the next is the calculation of the risk, relative risk. The risk scores, we all used to do it previously, but I think in the recent last few years, people have stopped looking for the risk scores, because after the 2010 and to 2020, most of us were starting with the imatinib as the first line, and we're not looking for this risk score. But now there is a recent, people started looking for it because the treatment goals has changed with the advance with the TFR now being now very clarity with the TFR. So we offer TFR at the baseline. So we all start looking for the related this score. The SOCAR UN UTOS used to be we used to most by using SOCAR score. But now what ALN 2020 has recommended is for the UTOS long-term survival score. So it has the same parameters, but what is the change in this UTOS long-term survival score is the age being given the negative prognostic value. So, and people who are in the elderly, they are less likely to die because of the CML. There could be the other reasons to die for these elderly. So age has a negative prognostic value. So even the patient elderly are not in the high risk. So less number of patients in the high risk now. And this tells best the leukemia related deaths, CML related deaths. So coming to the goals now. So now this is very interesting. Actually, it's not very clear. So in the early 1980s, only the complete hematological response used to be happening. Now patient has achieved a hematological response. Then it moved with the molecular monitoring, moved to the major cytogenetic response, to major molecular response, and 2010 deep molecular response. So after deep molecular response as a goal, people were looking for the normal life expectancy. But now in 2020, we are looking for the TFR and a normal survival without drug. And this is the goal. So this, I think most of us would be aware, this is the magic bullet which has revolutionized the treatment in the CML. So the TKI is the first line treatment for all except the pregnancy. We have the 4 drugs approved now. Bosutinib is the recent addition in the first line, the imatinib, dasatinib, and nilotinib. Redotinib is only in the South Korea, still pending the FDA approvals. So coming to the selection of the first line, I think many of us will not agree in all of my points, and it's the most controversial part. So what we look for while we select a first line therapy. So first is the life. What is most important for me? This is basically from the ASH 2020. So life expectancy not impacted by CML, which is the overreaching goal. And other, we look for the comorbidities to consider for the TKI selection, because especially for the second line, we should look for the comorbidities, the lifelong cost, age of the patient, definitely patient who is 80s, people less likely to die of the CML. So we can start the first line. We are not in hurry to early DMR in these patients. And now the TFR. So someone is having goals of TFR should think we should be strictly on the first line what should start. So preference second line, again, it's a bit controversial for in my talk. It's basically from ASH 2020. So the patients who are at high risk of treatment failure. So high clinical risk score, again, not everyone will agree, but I will be discussing in next few slides about this clinical risk scores. Again, the high risk additional chromosomal anomalies, which is clear in this recent guidelines of ALN 2020 also, that they should prefer for the second line because there are high chances of treatment failure. And P190 transcript, a goal of TFR as rapidly as possible. Yeah, this is a new addition now. And the women who still want to continue to have a family, not a plan. So this slide is basically to decide how the risk scores help to decide a second line TKI. So what everyone knows that there is no change in the overall survival and in the progression-free survival between the imatinib and the second line TKI, dasatinib, and nilotinib. But if we see the low risk and the high risk, and if you see the difference, the chance is because not much difference exists between the dasatinib and imatinib in the low risk cases, but the difference is significant if we see in the intermediate and the high risk patient. So patients who are in the high risk, there are more probability to going for the achieving a DMR and a early DMR in the patient who are taking the second line TKI, and they are high risk patients. So I think this is a summary of what I've discussed. So patient who is elderly definitely is less chances of dying by CML. So we don't think of jumping to start a second line TKI in the elderly, and imatinib I think is still the safest TKI now. So it's good for the elderly. But coming to someone who is less than 40, so we don't want the life to be affected from the CML. So best way is to go for the early DMR and the TFR. Discuss the TFR in those patients. So I would prefer to start the second line TKI. In other patients, we should look for the risk scores and the patient's choices for the TFR. Accordingly, we should decide for the second line TKI, whether we start as an upfront. So this is again from the ASH 2020. So coming to the selection based on the comorbidities, yes, it is important for, especially for the second line TKI, as imatinib we all know is a very safe drug, but if we go for a patient with diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dyslipidemia, definitely there is very high risk of getting these events on nilotinib. Usually, I think should not be preferred. And now we have other choices, so definitely we should not go for this. And patient who is in pulmonary hypertension, effusions, definitely dasatinib is not a preferable choice. And gastrointestinal issues, diarrhea and bosutinib, although grade 3-4 are not very common, but we should look for this. Coming to the second line treatment, which we usually start once there is the failure resistance, definitely we should change, and we should be accompanied by a TKD mutation testing. But if it is for intolerance, we don't need a TKD mutation. And next, how should we do it? So now I think everyone is doing by Sanger's or by NGS, but NGS has early detection because of data sensitivity. So I think it should be a preferable mode of doing a TKD mutation NGS, because the chances of getting a TKD mutation is only 1/3. So we should do use a more sensitive test. So now this is the list of the TKD mutations in the recent ALN 2020 guideline and the preferred drug for this. Now coming to the therapeutic response monitoring. So we have moved from the hematological response to cytogenetic, and now to the era of the molecular. We still look for the hematological response at 3 months, but now the era of the molecular response. So these are the milestones for treating CML. I think everyone knows this, and nothing has been changed from last ALN guidelines, only changes. It is the same for the first line and the second line. So one more thing is a change. We see the patients on, especially on imatinib, which continue to have a BCR-IS of around 0.2, 0.3, and they keep on asking what should be done. So what the ALN has said, that if the MMR is not, major molecular emission is not achieved by 36 months, we should look for a change in the TKI. Again, many will not agree with this. So coming to the most discussed topic in the CML now is the TFR. So when should we discontinue the TKI? So this is now we should discuss with every of our patient who we are going to start the therapy, that there are chances we can stop the treatment after 3, 4 or after 4 years to 5 years, and this should be told to them, and accordingly we should choose our TKI. So what we should look for first is the patient should be in the first CP only. There should not be any history of any disease progression. The most important point, which is the patient should be more motivated and in a good communication, which you should be in a very good communication with the patient. Access to high quality PCR, I think everyone has now, and patient's agreement for the early monitoring. So this is again very important, because after a few months, patient start asking, should we continue this monthly, or should we switch to 2 monthly, 3 monthly? So they should be very clear from the beginning itself. And which is as per the ALN, it's for monthly for 6 months, every 2 months for 6 to 12, and then 3 months. A little change in the NCCN, they advise for monthly for whole 1 year. So who are the candidates? Definitely, they are the first line or second line, but the change of second line is only intolerance. It should not be the resistance to the treatment, which is the difference from the NCCN, because they take the patients who are on second line because of the resistance of treatment, but not in the ELN guidelines. And the typical BCR-ABL transcript and the therapy of 5 years for first generation and 4 years for the second generation. The duration of deep molecular response of MR4 or better of more than 2 years, and no, as discussed, no prior treatment failure. So coming to the NCCN recommendations, a little differences are there. That one is the same, that second line TKI change because of the, even because of the resistance, they could be taken for the TFR, and other the duration of the TKI. Here it's only 3 years duration with the MR4 of 2 years or more. So I think I have not discussed the recent advances in the CML treatment. There is not much has come in the recent years. So we have bosutinib as the first line. We have redotinib. We still need FDA approval for other places other than Korea. And we have asciminib, which is in phase 3 trials. I think will be soon available, especially for T315I mutations. And we have one more addition, which recently we have seen in 2 randomized trials, where the imatinib combined with pegylated interferon alpha, their probability of achieving early molecular response, deep molecular response. So let's see how in the future, but still there are 2 randomized trials which have proved this. So now I will summarize. So now we have a new UTOS long-term survival score, which is the better, less number of patients in the high risk category, and we could be helpful to start the second line TKI. Second is that we should do a bone marrow aspiration and cytogenetics in all of our patients, and it's required now. And we should identify the high risk additional chromosomal anomalies at the baseline, because this is the high risk. These are the high risk, not as a warning as in the 2013 guidelines. Now we should have a clear treatment goal at the beginning of the therapy. If you discuss TFR to every patient now, and now we have a very clear, good clarity over the TFR. Thank you. Open for the questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Farhan. You have completed it in time, also very nicely summarized the big CML topic. So yes, I agree. Sir, Tilak, sir.
Yeah, go on.
So 2 things I do like to repeat over here, that yes, the bone marrow part is very important at the baseline. I think the confusion has started because people said that BCR-ABL, whether you do it from periphery or from bone marrow, doesn't make much of difference. So it took the entire thing to a different direction. People started thinking that bone marrow is not required at all. But I think baseline bone marrow is very important.
That's what I said, the baseline marrow, and especially we should go for the cytogenetics in all patients. It's very important.
And the other problem, which is about the TFR being in the government sector, what I feel is these days, the problem with the TFR, what I feel is that the drugs are cheaper, particularly imatinib, when being used, drugs are cheaper than the monitoring. So it really sometimes become a little difficult to convince the patients, rather and more frequent blood test. Blood test, that's a big thing in India. So they would like to take a pill every day rather than doing the blood test and spending money.
The most important is the motivation of the patient, a good communication, and they should be convinced for this monthly test. This is most important before talking about the TFR.
Thank you, Dr. Naim. I think very succinctly put, and such a large topic, very lucidly covered in a short span of time. We have on board the doyen of chronic myeloid leukemia, Dr. Hemant Malhotra. Sir, good evening. Wish you a very happy new year. How are you, sir?
Hi, Tilak. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you, sir. We would like to have some comments from you, sir.
I think the first and the most fervent comment is that Dr. Farhan has done a fantastic job. We have now CML meetings lasting 3 and 4 days, and he summarized everything in 20 minutes. So my, heartiest congratulations to Dr. Farhan for covering everything so well. And I think the other few things is very well highlighted at diagnosis. Marrow should be done. Finding out about marrow fibrosis and additional chromosomal abnormalities is important. Monitoring at frequent intervals, particularly in the first year by RT-PCR, is extremely important. at the first sign that the patient is not doing well, particularly on the first generation TKI imatinib, you must look for compliance, because after 6, 8, 10 months, the patient and the family become complacent and they feel that they don't have any disease anymore, their counts are normal, they tend to stop or reduce the medications. So ensuring compliance is very important. So a choice of second generation TKI, now fortunately we have at least 3 of the second generation agents available to us on a generic basis, and they are a lot more affordable, and the choice will depend upon what kind of mutation the patient has and what kind of comorbidities the patient has. And I think we should not forget for the young patient that allogenic stem cell transplantation still remains an option, even though for a smaller number of patients. With regards to TFR, I think all patients, particularly young patients, should be talked about TFR right at the beginning. And they should also be explained that this is going to be possible in only about 1/3 of all patients. Rest of the patients, which we are, tending to, forget now, that 60 to 70% of the patients will have to take the TKI for life. But TFR is a reality. It is science now, and it has to be talked about to the patient, particularly the young patient and particularly young female patients in the childbearing age. And toxicity monitoring for all the first and the second generation TKIs is very vital. Long-term toxicities with nilotinib, we all know that should be very carefully monitored, anticipated. All primary prevention methods should be instituted. Similarly for dasatinib, also for bosutinib. And now we're also seeing, a gradual decline in creatinine clearance with imatinib. So that also needs to be, periodically assessed. And again, congratulations to Dr. Farhan for a very nice talk. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. And as Kundan sir rightly said in the start, that with the pleasant personality of Farhan. So Tilak sir, I'd like to say that Farhan is with me for last 1.5 years, 2 years. So it is becoming a difficult challenge that patients have stopped coming in my OPD now.
That's
So-
what probably Kundan was saying.
Yeah. So what Dr. Kundan is saying is very right. So with people like Farhan in OPD, so it becomes a real challenge to keep your OPD running.
It's not exactly I.
So over to the chairpersons for the next talk, Dr. Nitin Sood
Yeah, Kundan, you
is
can-
waiting.
So
Yeah.
Nitin sir doesn't require any kind of introduction, and recently the kind of academic feast he had organized, that was really a pleasure to be part of that. And he's already here, so I'd like to welcome him for his talk. And so over to you, Nitin sir.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. So just give me a minute to start sharing my presentation. I hope you can hear me and see my presentation now. So I'll put it in presentation mode.
We can.
So I'm starting right on time, and the topic given to me was role of ibrutinib in mantle cell lymphoma, and the current approaches associated with it. That's me. And so mantle cell lymphoma, as everybody knows, is a rare but aggressive B-cell malignancy. It's a bit confusing. Sometimes we put it as aggressive. Sometimes we say it's an indolent lymphoma. So it's somewhere in between. But the problem with mantle cell has always been that we don't have a standard first-line therapy for mantle cell lymphoma. And so it becomes very difficult for us to choose A, first-line therapy, and B, the following therapy. But there have been some recent advances, and that's what I'm going to focus my talk on. So after relapse, the median progression-free survival is short. We measure that in months. And if we have something better, then we should seriously think about using that. And ibrutinib is one of such agents. And I think acalabrutinib has already been talked about. It's a BTK inhibitor, acalabrutinib being the more selective second generation BTK inhibitor. But my talk will focus on ibrutinib. So the current treatment landscape in mantle cell, if you have a young, fit patient, then Ara-C or cytarabine is a fantastic drug. We should make all efforts to use cytarabine in first line, either in DAP or hyper-CVAD. But most people tend to give CHOP, and CHOP and RDAP combination has to be looked at seriously. But anything more than R-CHOP for a young and fit patient, followed by transplant and maintenance. So the less aggressive approaches are BR and RCHOP, and recently replacing the VR cap. So replacing or adding bortezomib to some sort of CHOP-based therapy. The problem with most of our patients need less aggressive chemotherapy. And the problem is that the less aggressive chemotherapy would lead to less deep responses and more frequent relapses. Maintenance after RCHOP is approved, and rituximab maintenance, if they're not fit for a transplant, is a viable option for the less fit patients. But what do we do when they relapse? And the relapses happen quite frequently in mantle cell. And it's said that mantle cell will invariably relapse. So the approach that we follow and the approach that I'm going to demonstrate in the next few slides is that if the relapse is quick after chemotherapy, and most centers accept that less than 2 years is a quicker relapse, then you offer a non-cross-reactive approach, an approach which is a BTK inhibitor, either ibrutinib, acalabrutinib, zanubrutinib, which we don't have access to, but Lenritux and venetoclax are, again, venetoclax we don't have access to, but are viable options. But if you have a relatively fit patient and he's relapsed later on, then chemoimmunotherapy still remains a good option for them. So my talk is going to focus on the quick relapse and what evidence do we have for ibrutinib use.
Hello, Dr. Nitin, can you hear us?
I think Dr. Nitin has lost the connection.
Sir, we'll wait for a couple of minutes, or
yeah, maybe you can try calling him on phone and find out.
Yeah, sure.
DLBCL, and I realized that when we use this with in the full doses, the chances of fungal infections are very, very high. So we wanted to use voriconazole along with that, and we realized that once we use voriconazole along with ibrutinib, the dose of ibrutinib almost comes down to 1/4. We just needed to use 1 capsule instead of 4 capsules, and that we found it quite interesting when it comes to cost restraint. To use ibrutinib in these cases. Anybody else with their experience on ibrutinib in clinical practice apart from CLL?
I think, Tilak, this is Hemant again.
Yes, sir.
I think there is some pretty solid laboratory data, particularly from a lady from MD Anderson, good friend of ours, Dr. Varsha Gandhi, that to saturate the receptors and to maintain ibrutinib levels, only 1 capsule is what is needed. And, you know, the initial trial, I don't know why it was done with the presently dose, but there is a big body of evidence that just 1 capsule of ibrutinib is enough, at least in the CLL front. I'm not sure whether there's data on the lymphoma front, but on the CLL front, lots of us tend to believe that that 1 pill is as good as 3.
Dr. Shyam, sir, any experience on this?
I just joined, so I don't know what you know.
Ibrutinib in non-Hodgkin's lymphomas use clinical practice and clinical experience.
You know, I think maybe a few patients. I think 1 patient we had who had CNS involvement, and we did check. You know, ibrutinib I think does cross blood-brain barrier, so that patient took it for I think a few months, but really didn't do very well. But I think in Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia, in I think 2nd line, we do have experience of using ibrutinib. Of course, CLL is the first line indication.
So Dr. Nitin is back online.
Yeah, Dr. Nitin is back.
I'm really sorry about that. I think
No problem.
something happened with the internet, and I don't know how far you could hear me, but I'll just start the presentation again. So we were at phase 2, the phase 2 PCYC 1104 trial, which was one of the first evidences that we got from ibrutinib. And patients with confirmed mantle and measurable nodal disease were enrolled into this trial. Patients who've had 1 to 5 previous therapies, so who've had multiple lines of therapy, not a very easy population, a tough population to treat. And they recruited about 115 patients and gave them all ibrutinib 560 milligrams, which has subsequently become the standard dose for mantle cell. And the primary endpoints were overall response rates in these populations, and of course, secondary endpoints being progression-free and overall survival, duration of response, and safety of the drug. So in this phase 2 trial, they found that the median initial time to initial response was 2 months, 1.9 months. So it doesn't work straight away. It takes time to work. Median time to CR or a complete response was 5.5 months. So you've got to be very patient with the drug. And median duration is about 18 months. So once it starts to work, it works well. So remember, this is not a very easy population, tough population to treat. And despite that, the median progression-free survival that they got was about 13 months with a median overall survival of 22 months. So the next one is MCL 3001 or RAY trial. And this was the first phase 3 trial evidence we got from ibrutinib. And so these are patients who have previously been treated for mantle cell, and they were randomized, and it was 1-to-1 randomization. And temsirolimus was compared to ibrutinib. So temsirolimus in those times used to be the standard of care for relapsed mantle. I personally never used it, but it's an intravenous drug, and it's given on day 1, 8, and 15 or in cycles. And ibrutinib in the standard dose of 560 milligrams was compared. And they were treated in both arms to either progressive disease or unacceptable toxicity from the drug. So fortunately, crossover to ibrutinib for people who progressed on temsirolimus was permitted. And primary endpoints were again progression-free survival with overall survival and response rates as secondary endpoints. They also factored in safety. So investigator assessed progression-free survival and overall survival was 15.6 months and 30.3 months respectively with ibrutinib, which is quite good and much better compared to the closest competitor, which is temsirolimus at that time. So with a median follow-up about 38.7 months, significant progression-free survival, and there was a strong trend to OS benefit. So this is the curves which are separated by prior lines of therapy, and the blue ones are ibrutinib with 1 prior therapy, and the brown ones are temsirolimus. The solid lines with more than one, solid lines with 1 prior line of therapy, which means the drug is used as second line, and the broken lines more than 1 prior line of therapy. So if you divide them and just look at 1 prior line of therapy, ibrutinib did much better in progression-free survival terms and obviously overall survival terms than the closest competitor, which is temsirolimus. So response rates, CR rates for ibrutinib doubled when it was used in 1 prior line of therapy versus later on, and the median duration of response was almost 2 years for ibrutinib versus only 6 months for temsirolimus. So time to next treatment, which is an indicator which is used more and more by statisticians now, because that's almost a surrogate for progression-free survival, and it also tells us that if the drug has an influence on the natural course or the natural history of the disease, was prolonged almost 3 times from 11 months for temsirolimus and 31 months for ibrutinib. The other indicator that statisticians often use now is time to second progression or death, which means the PFS after the drug has been stopped. Again, this is an indicator to say if the natural course of disease being altered by the drug, and if the drug has an effect beyond the time when the drug is being used. So time to second progression or PFS2 was about 26 months as opposed to 15 for temsirolimus. So remained longer for ibrutinib than for temsirolimus with additional follow-up. So one of the other things that the statisticians can do is a pooled analysis. And for pooled analysis, you need similar populations treated with similar drugs. And what a pooled analysis does is pools a lot of patients from different trials. And that gives us a better indication and a stronger evidence, better grade of recommendation for a particular drug. And this happens a lot for drugs in earlier phases of development and for drugs where there's very little evidence available. So pooled analysis from PCYC 1104, SPARK, and RAY. And in the RAY trial, only the patients treated with ibrutinib. So from approximately 100 patients from each pool, but it became 370 after you pooled the patients. And at the start, they were randomized to receive ibrutinib. The first pooled analysis was done at 24 months, which is 2 years. And then the next one, 41 months. So this pooled analysis presented to present the results of 3.5-year follow-up from this similar pool. So it shows that progression-free survival, which is the brown curve, and with ibrutinib, and the blue curve separates out quite early on and remains, and the benefit remains, and overall survival, the median is not reached for overall survival. So PFS and OS were 12.5 and 26 months respectively. And patients ibrutinib who received ibrutinib in second line had better outcomes versus patients who were treated in later lines. So again, that's a very intuitive thing, because the earlier you use the drug, the more susceptible the disease is for the drug, and you get better responses. So by best response, if you stratify, overall response rates and CR rates were higher in second versus later lines of treatment, and the later you get, the worse the response gets. So median progression-free and overall survival were not reached in patients who achieved a CR versus patients who did not achieve a CR. So in patients who were PR, the progression-free survival was only about a year. So if you get a deep response, then the response is going to last longer. Again, a very intuitive thing, but the evidence presented by this pool analysis. So median duration of response was twice as long with earlier versus later use. So almost 3 years versus a year and a half. And patients with PR and the duration of response was still longer, but not as long as patients who got a CR. So duration of response was consistently better, regardless of prior treatment and regardless of the kind of response you got. So all these trials would give us therapy emergent adverse effects, and they tell us whether these adverse effects are just because of the older population, or because of the disease, or because these are therapy related adverse effects. And this tells us that the BTK inhibitors give us cytopenias which are significant and therapy related, and of course pneumonia and atrial fibrillation and bleeding and bruising, as we know, and which are the kind of specific adverse effects that we now know to be associated with BTK inhibitors. The adverse effects get better with time, and you can see the bar figures, the bar keeps dropping as time goes along, and most of the adverse effects get better as you continue to use the drug. So in summary, the 3.5-year follow-up of ibrutinib showed that ibrutinib was a highly effective drug with responses which are durable, and some of the responses lasted beyond 5 years. The CRs were highly durable, and the clinical outcomes were best for patients who received ibrutinib early on. And grade 3 therapy-related emergent adverse effects, including AF, were less common the longer ibrutinib was used. So then this pooled analysis was followed up by a 7.5-year follow-up, which means we've got longer follow-up for these drugs now. And there are no emergent safety signals with longer follow-up that we need to worry about. So again, PCYC 1104, the RAY trial and the SPARK trial, patients were pooled and they were put in the CAN 3001 study. And they were followed up for progression-free survival and tumor response, which were investigator assessed. So median follow-up was about 41 months, and median exposure to the drug was about 11 months. So this gives us a progression-free survival with one prior line therapy for about a little more than 2 years, and with less than one prior line of therapy, less than a year. So PFS with ibrutinib was longer than time to next treatment on the prior regimen, almost half the patients that were pulled into this analysis. So it is giving us longer progression-free survival, and it is giving us deeper responses, and irrespective of whether it's a low-risk disease, whether there's extranodal disease, whether there's bulky disease, and TP53. So very few patients had high-risk disease. This is a busy slide, but again, it tries to say that overall response rates, progression-free survival, overall survival, and duration of response was better with one prior line of therapy, which means if ibrutinib was used in second line instead of more than one prior line of therapy, where it's used in third, fourth, fifth lines of therapy. So overall responses about more than double for what we see for more than one prior line of therapy. So there are clear indication that the earlier that you use ibrutinib, the better responses you're going to get. So patients who received ibrutinib as second line, these were the patient characteristics, and there were a lot of patients which we typically see in our clinics. About half of these patients were more than 70 years old. About a quarter had high-risk disease. And again, these people got median progression-free survival of 13 months, time to next treatment 14 months, duration of response 22 months. So the response is also lasting longer with ibrutinib. So the pooled analysis concluded that ibrutinib in relapsed and refractory mental extended follow-up for up to 7.5 years indicates a late plateau in the PFS curve, which means that if you continue to use it, the benefit will continue. And treatment with ibrutinib in second versus later line of therapies will give you better benefit compared to later lines of therapy. So if you have to use it, then use it early. And patients who achieve CR as compared to partial responses had more durable and deeper responses, and their median duration of survival and progression-free survival was more than 5 years. And more importantly, there was no notable emerging toxicity, no additional safety signals for after almost about 7.5 years. So to conclude, ibrutinib is currently approved as after one line of therapy, and so is acalabrutinib now. And ibrutinib represents a chemo-free once daily targeted therapy, a simple tablet that patients can take at home, and has shown improved outcomes. Side effects are generally manageable and they get better with time. We have to pre-screen our patients very carefully to make sure they don't have a bleeding, bruising, or a atrial or a heart kind of conduction disorder, especially atrial fibrillation, and various future trials, which I couldn't show because of lack of time, but there are various future trials which are bringing ibrutinib into the front line of therapy now. And ibrutinib is rapidly moving to front line, and as time passes, we'll see ibrutinib being approved or other BTK inhibitors being approved for frontline therapy. So that's all I have, and I'm quite happy to take any questions. I'm sorry about the interruption.
Thank you, Dr. Nitin. Very nicely covered, and looks like a very, very promising drug for use in mantle cell lymphoma, especially with 7.5 years follow-up and still having the CR patients doing so very well. Like you said, quite a few intuitive thoughts in the entire presentation. What is your thought on the dosage which was being used? Do you think that maybe we can come down on the dosage, especially when you have to use antifungals? That's what we were discussing when you had just gone offline. You know, when you have to use antifungals along with ibrutinib because of the drug interactions, the levels seem to be higher with ibrutinib. So can we come down on the doses? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of this, and I mean, personally speaking, I've never done that, but you know, probably there was a stronger reason to do that when there was ibrutinib was so expensive. But at the moment, I don't know. It's a bit tricky to use in absence of therapeutic drug levels, which again is untested. It's very tricky to use agents which improve or increase the levels of ibrutinib, because that's what azoles do. They reduce the metabolism of ibrutinib, and they would kind of increase blood levels. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think many people have done that, and It's just a bit tricky. I've never personally done that.
Thank you very much. We had a wonderful session on hematology, and I thank all the speakers for this session. I would like to hand over in the final to my hematology colleague, Dr. Kundan Mishra, to sum up the session. Kundan, over to you.
So really, it's a very lucid presentation by our speakers. I'd like to thank Dr. Satish from Columbia Asia, Dr. Farhan from Sarvodaya, and Dr. Nitin sir from Medanta MedCity. Thank you very much for this nice talk. And I think we have already crossed our time by 3 minutes. I thank to all of you. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you everyone for this lovely thing, and thank you to the two lovely chairpersons, Dr. Tilak and Dr. Kundan.